I'm going to show you my favorite lenses for church live streams on a budget. But before we do that, we need to talk about what you should actually be looking for in a lens. Now just be warned, lenses can get very, very expensive very quickly. But I think the ones on this list are realistic options at a pretty good price point for really any church that's streaming using a DSLR or mirrorless type camera. Now, I'm not including any true cine lenses or servo lenses because I just don't think they're realistic options for churches on a real budget. Now, if you disagree, leave me a comment below with some of your favorites. I may want to try them out. There are 4 big points that are super important to keep in mind when shopping for lenses. Number 1, will it actually fit your camera? Now this may sound obvious to some, but different camera manufacturers use different mounts for their lenses. For example, Canon uses an EF and an RF mount, Sony uses an E mount, there are Micro Four Thirds lenses, etc, etc. It's not super important what the different types all are, just make sure that the lenses you're looking for will actually fit on your cameras. Now keep in mind that you can also adapt different mounts to each other using third-party adapters. I wouldn't count on that as the main way to get compatible lenses though, unless you're upgrading the size of the lens, such as going from a Micro Four Thirds to something more like an EF lens. Now the second thing you should look for in your lens is the focal length. A lens's focal length determines how close or far the lens can actually see. If it's a low number, such as 18 millimeters, that's a wide lens and it has a wide field of view. This is good if you're going to be capturing things up close and still want to see a lot of area of the subject. Or if you want a really wide angle shot of your whole room. If it's a higher number, such as say 200 millimeters, that's what's known as a telephoto lens. It's going to be more like looking through a telescope. That is, it can reach subjects that are much farther away than a wide lens. Another thing to note about the focal length is that some lenses are zoom lenses, where they have a range of focal lengths that you can change between, such as a 24 to 70 millimeters. These are great when you need to capture different types of shots with the same lens. It just kind of adds a certain layer of flexibility to the lens. Conversely, some lenses just have a single fixed focal length. These are known as prime lenses. Oftentimes these lenses have better optics overall than their zoom lens counterparts. So while they may not offer the same flexibility that a zoom lens might, they'll often have benefits in the quality of the image that you're able to capture. The third thing that you need to look for when purchasing lenses is the aperture. This is denoted by the letter F followed by some number. If you don't know what aperture is, I'd highly recommend watching this video to learn more about it. But the quick version is that the smaller the number, the wider the opening is in front of your camera sensor, allowing more light into the sensor. This also results in a much shallower depth of field, which is one of the hallmarks of the more popular cinematic style of a church live stream. Oftentimes, prime lenses are able to have much lower apertures than zoom lenses, offering a certain advantage if that's something that matters to you. You may also hear these lenses referred to as being fast lenses. This is because they can achieve the same exposure as some other lens, but with a faster shutter speed. Now, you may not need to know the origin of that term, but it's good to know that that's what it's referring to in case you see that nomenclature somewhere. Some zoom lenses have variable apertures, which means that as you zoom the lens in further, the minimum f-stop actually gets larger. You may see this on a lens labeled something like f4 to 5.6. This can have some unintended effects for video, because your exposure levels will actually change as you progress through the focal range. It may not be a problem to you, but it's worth keeping in mind. You can also always keep the aperture wider than the minimum, which means it will actually stay at that value throughout the entire focal range. Now, another note here. Sometimes people freak out that the aperture isn't low enough on certain lenses, especially when using longer telephoto lenses. And while I get that shallow depths of field are all the rage right now, there's another concept at play known as lens compression that might be interesting to know about. I won't get into the nitty-gritty of it here, but since these telephoto lenses are usually quite far from the subject, oftentimes the background will actually appear compressed and more out of focus, creating something similar to the shallow depth of field that you would achieve with a much lower f-stop value on a wider lens. This means that a telephoto lens with, say, an f4 will sometimes still achieve the same cinematic look that you're going for as a closer-up lens with an f2.8. Definitely test and verify with your particular use case, but just remember, aperture isn't everything. Finally, the fourth thing to think about when picking out lenses is what you're actually going to be using them for. You may have heard good things about a particular lens or two and think that those are the only ones that you should buy because they're the best, even if they don't really make any sense for where your cameras are actually going to be and what shots you really want to get for your live stream. Think through your camera plot and the types of shots that you actually want each camera to capture, and let that help determine the lenses that you should actually pick and purchase. For example, even though most people would probably use a pretty wide lens on their dolly camera to get shots of the room, we actually use a lens with a focal range of 14 to 140 millimeters because we also use it to get tight shots of vocalists on stage. There's nothing worse than spending a lot of money on a lens and then realizing that it just doesn't really accomplish what you want it to. One more small tip here. If you're not sure what a particular lens will look like in your space, I'd recommend the app CADrange Viewfinder. It allows you to pick particular cameras and then particular focal lengths, and it will show you what that frame would look like if you use that combination all through your iPhone's viewfinder. Now, full disclosure, I've never personally used the app, but I've heard nothing but good reviews, so it might be worth trying out for you if you're kind of curious what lenses will work. So great, now you know what to actually look for in a lens, so here are some of my personal favorites. First off, my absolute favorite for a handheld stage cam has to be the Sigma 18 to 35mm f1.8. These lenses look amazing and at an amazing price. Brand new, they're just over $600, and you can usually find them used for about $400. They're a pretty manageable size, and they're nice because the barrel doesn't actually extend as you zoom in and out, which is super nice when you're doing run and gun type work on a stage. The f1.8 aperture means you've got a super nice bokeh, and honestly the whole lens just looks great. One thing to note about this one is that it's technically sized for an APS-C size sensor, so if you're using something that's full frame, there will be a bit of a crop to deal with. It's not too bad though, and honestly I think it's still worth it because this lens is fantastic. We use 2 of these on stage every Sunday, and I could not be happier with the way that they look. By the way, links to buy all these lenses will be down below in the video description. Lens number 2 is a 24 to 70 f2.8. I specifically use the Canon EF version, but all the big names make one. This lens is a workhorse and a classic amongst every single person in the world who owns a camera. It's got a nice zoom range, so it's still great for handheld work on the stage, but gives you a little bit more reach than the 18 to 35 does. The aperture doesn't get quite as low, but the bokeh still looks pretty nice to me, and the lens is just sharp. It's definitely gonna be a bit heavier, but this lens has it where it counts. It's also gonna cost a bit more than the 18 to 35. Used ones usually sit around $1,000, but don't worry, these lenses last, and so used is definitely a real option. Definitely consider this one if you don't wanna be quite as wide and maybe need more of a telephoto reach. My third lens is another classic, the 70 to 200 f2.8. Again, I use the Canon version, but get the one that works for you. This guy is hefty, so I wouldn't really recommend hand holding it for a whole church service, but this is gonna be a great as a slash cam or something else that needs a little bit of a punch, but nothing too crazy. It's f2.8 throughout the entire zoom, and combined with the lens compression you'll get, your backgrounds will be nice and creamy and the subjects will just pop. You can get versions of this lens with stabilization if you want to try to hold it, but that's up to you. Again, this is going to be a pricier lens, sitting around that $1,000 used mark yet again. But these lenses last and hold their resale value, so it's definitely worth picking one up to have in your arsenal if it makes sense for your camera plot. The final pick I'm going to specifically call out is a bit of a dark horse. It's the Sigma 150 to 600mm f5 to 6.3. This lens is great if you need to put your main follow cam way back in your sanctuary like we do, but you still want to be able to get a tight shot of your worship leader or your pastor. It's got a crazy long focal range so it can get insanely tight, but still pull out to get full body type shots when you need them. It's got a variable aperture and it's fairly slow, but when you're zoomed into 600mm, it's almost impossible to keep a moving target in focus any lower than that anyway. So I think it's totally acceptable as long as you can get enough light into it. This lens is about $1,000 brand new, so technically it's a little cheaper than the last two. And look, this lens is not for everybody, but if you're struggling to find a lens on a budget that can really punch in tight from those long distances, this might be the one for you. That's it for specific lenses that I'm gonna recommend, but if you're into primes, take a look at the other Sigma Art series lenses. You also can't go wrong with first-party lenses from Canon, Sony, etc. Again, just find the lenses that make the most sense for you, your camera plot, and the story that you're trying to actually tell with your live stream. Lenses are important, yes, but at the end of the day, you can still capture a great live stream on just the kit lens that came with your cameras, as long as you know how to use them correctly. Training for your volunteers is way more important than gear, 100 times out of 100, and that's a hill I'm willing to die on. I hope this helps you find lenses that work well for you, and let me know in the comments if you love any that I missed or if you have any other questions. Until next time.